Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Knockout Podcast, episode 64. Now, we're back after a short 1 week absence, but in all honesty, that you did not miss a lot. However, we do return to at least talk over some pretty entertaining fights from the weekend. Certainly, that main event in the form of Cory Sandhagen versus TJ Dillashaw. As ever, I'm joined by Jack. Jack, how are you doing? Especially as I've just turned your attention to the fantastic card we've got coming up at the weekend.
Doing brilliantly. Yeah, not too bad. The night of fights, at least from what I've watched of it, was pretty good. I enjoyed them. It somewhat that like on paper it didn't look like to be the best card, but like the matchups kind of worked quite well and they were fun enough. So yeah, I'm doing all right.
Yeah, compared to some of the other cards we've got coming up on paper, which certainly look a bit drab, this one delivered and certainly so in the form of the main event, which we may as well start with. TJ Dillashaw defeating Cory Sandhagen, or Sandhagen, however you say it, split decision 47-48, and then two 48-47s. We'll get to discussions on scoring and, I don't want to throw the word robbery out there because it wasn't, but I have seen that. Basically any scorecard that is disagreed with is now a robbery, but we'll get on to sort of scoring debates. I think, seeming though he won the fight in the judges' eyes, I think the focus is, at least to start with, should be on TJ Dillashaw, his return from a 2-year USADA ban for EPO and God knows what. And what did you make of his first fight back in 2 years? I think you see boxers don't fight for sort of 9 months and they have one or two tune-up fights. It's fair to say Dillashaw came straight out of his suspension and basically fought the third, fourth best bantamweight that the company has to offer.
Yeah, it's weird. The UFC really don't like tune-up fights, and they've kind of sold that as a strength. And in some senses, like it can be, but there are definitely times where tune-up fights are warranted, and this might have been one of them. But despite that, Dillashaw did look fairly good. Maybe not necessarily. To be fair, not far off prime, really. Like he didn't look noticeably faded in any way. And if you compare him to his flyweight fight with Henry Cejudo, which was his last fight, clearly his chin had improved tenfold, and it was really the cut to flyweight was the killer for that, realistically. I think that's essentially been confirmed now. But yeah, he came back, and whilst now nominally or supposedly no longer being on EPO, unconfirmed as of yet, his cardio held up fairly well. Like he was able to push it. The fight was pretty high paced, and they were both able to keep it up for the 5 rounds. So it was Dillashaw looked fairly decent, I thought. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I think for me he looked perhaps a tad slower. I'm not sure that's to be unexpected given he is 35 now. I think maybe that's also the case that you're comparing him, or at least I'm comparing him against Cory Sandhagen, who's certainly swift of feet. And yeah, you mentioned his chin. I think certainly that move back to bantamweight is certainly a massive reason for it. But I think it does show that if you take 2 years out, whether sort of by sort of injury or by suspension, constantly having your chin hit, whether that's by frequent fighting, frequent camps, frequent sparring, is going to affect, or at least isn't going to do your chin any favors. Probably taking a year out of proper hard intensive sparring, which I imagine he did. At least
you'd probably think so. Yeah,
you'd imagine so. I think it does show that clearly can do great things for your ability to take a punch, and he certainly did take quite a few. decent punches. I mean, we'll get into the fight itself. Very back and forth. Both fighters had their moments. Dillashaw pushing forward and doing some decent work against the cage. I mean, he sort of had good positions, but never really threatened to sort of progress them to anything more dangerous. Sandhagen, I think, clearly had the advantage when the striking was out there in the open and clipped him quite a few times. And it all really came down to that final round. I looked at the scorecards, and they all had, I think, what was it, round 1 and 3 for Dillashaw and 2 and 4 for Sandhagen, or was it 2 and...
I think one. It was kind of split or like mixed judging. I think one judge that gave it to Dillashaw gave him round 4. One gave him round 5. They couldn't make their mind up, basically.
It largely came down to that final round, which I watched again and was very close. I mean, how did you particularly score it? I think I'd probably push for Sandhagen to have taken that final round. I think Dillashaw certainly won 2, but a lot of his work up against the cage didn't seem to be sort of he wasn't sort of progressing positions as much as I think he needed to be to warrant that sort of control time to be deemed as sort of effective or damaging. Control time, I think, is often misleading because 2 minutes sort of controlling your opponent but essentially doing nothing with it shouldn't really be graded positively towards giving that person a round. I mean, the takedown itself is a positive, but if you don't do anything with the position, then it's sort of often misconstrued.
So the official scoring criteria is like ordered, and it goes effective striking and grappling is like the fight is judged on effective striking and grappling, and only if they can't be separated on those grounds does it go to the next criteria, which are things like I think it's octagon control and aggression or something. And so when people talk about the scoring, they'll often say, "Oh, Dillashaw was pushing forward" or whatever, and that literally doesn't matter. Whether Dillashaw was pushing forward does not matter unless you cannot separate them at all on effective striking and grappling, and those are the rules. And effective essentially means damaging or moving the fight towards a conclusion, so moving towards a finish. And Dillashaw's holding against the cage, kneeing the legs, like a little bit damaging, and he is controlling him. He's like, so from a kind of strategic point of view, it's a good thing to do in the fight, but from a scoring standpoint, it doesn't score very high, or shouldn't score very highly, because he's not really moving the fight towards a conclusion in that sense, whereas Sandhagen landing heavy shots to the chin on the back foot is. So I think if you look at it from that perspective, and that's how fights are meant to be scored, I think that Sandhagen certainly won 2, 4, and 5. I think from that perspective, it's difficult to give Dillashaw rounds 4 and 5 for me. But yeah, so I think that there is a lot of people do misunderstand a lot of the judging criteria. Even the judges maybe sometimes. Because you see some decisions. But yeah, basically it didn't matter that that Dillashaw was the one moving forward, realistically. Although I've seen some good comparisons between this and another TJ Dillashaw fight, which is the Dominic Cruz fight, and this was similar in quite a few ways, with kind of TJ playing the TJ role consistently, but Cruz and Sandhagen, they were the ones on the back foot, and it's interesting that Dominic Cruz got the decision over TJ, despite the fact he was far less effective on the back foot than Sandhagen was. Sandhagen did a lot more damage to Dillashaw than Dominic Cruz did. Yet Cruz got the decision over TJ, Sandhagen didn't. I find that to be a bit strange, and doesn't really make sense to me, because I would score, I haven't watched it in a while, but I would score the TJ Cruz fight for TJ, but I'd score this fight for Sandhagen. So
yeah, it's an interesting one. But
yeah, it is odd.
that is just sometimes how it works. I mean, I think we talked a bit about TJ, and I think it's fair to mention I think we need to talk about Sandhagen as well. Another good performance for him, even in defeat. I think there's still elements of his game where perhaps similar to sort of, I see it's perhaps similar to Charles Oliveira in a sense where there's a sort of willingness to accept the fight taking place anywhere in the octagon, whether that's against the cage, on the floor, or standing up, and that's good. And I think he's certainly shown improvements, especially from the Aljamain Sterling fight in terms of his grappling and his ability to, Dillashaw found it particularly difficult to get him down, even if he was getting him to the fence and perhaps getting a sort of backlock in. But I think there's, a couple of times, I think probably in the 2 rounds that he lost was him perhaps throwing something he didn't need to, or sort of accepting the position on the ground when he didn't need to. And it's not careless. That's too harsh. But I feel like there is something about his sort of just elite, in these elite fights, that he needs to just be a bit more refined and ensure that the fight is taking place where he wants to. Because when the fight was standing up, he was piecing Dillashaw up, and I think maybe against other fighters and on his way up, we've seen that he's fairly free flowing and quite comfortable to take the fight anywhere, because he's so much better than 90% of this bantamweight roster. But it's just against those sort of top 3 or 4 guys that I think he just has to be more careful and more sort of determined to keep the fight where his strengths lie. We saw that in the Marlon Moraes fight. He kept the fight where he needed the fight to be and pieced him together. And I think he could have done that against Dillashaw a bit better.
Yeah, I think if you look at it from a kind of like strategic level, TJ did a much better job of implementing his strategy in this fight than Sandhagen did. TJ was consistently throughout almost the entire fight was able to get the kind of fight that he needed to win. He was the one pushing forward, pressing into exchanges and forcing wrestling exchanges on Sandhagen, whilst forcing Sandhagen to win, or try and win via a back foot countering game. And even though I think that on a kind of tactical level, Sandhagen did better at that, and I think still won, Sandhagen is a better fighter when he's pressing forward and building combinations off the jab, but he wasn't able to do that at all in this fight because of a kind of I suppose, lack of strategic awareness, or lack of being able to fully implement that. So I think looking at it from that perspective of a strategy versus tactics kind of thing is quite an interesting way to look at this fight. I think it's quite an easy one to see it for. Of how they kind of differ. But yeah, certainly I agree that Sandhagen does, especially going forward, needs to do a better job of enforcing the kind of exchanges that he wants and he needs to win the fight, which he definitely didn't do here. And then also, there are plenty of things that he does well, but there are certain things that he doesn't do particularly well. The reason why he wasn't able to enforce that is because his kind of cage craft and ring octagon awareness isn't the best. He can get caught up, or he kind of pressures himself often. You saw straight away, soon as the bell rang, round 1, Dillashaw comes straight out. Sandhagen comes out to meet him, but then almost immediately backs off and kind of pressures himself to the fence. And to an extent, that can work for him. It does allow him to draw people onto counters, like the flying knees, for example. But I think that you can't build, or it's difficult in MMA to build a consistent game off of that. And I think Sandhagen is much better when he's pressing forward and building off his jab, which he was only really able to land things in kind of like single shots in this fight. And I just don't think it's kind of really his style. So there's that, but he does show kind of, sometimes he does have good ideas or can like show good kind of like pivots and stuff to get himself off the fence. He's just quite inconsistent with it. So, so the fact that he does show it in kind of like spurts means that there is like, he's able to work on it. So in a sense, it's still encouraging. Like if he wasn't doing it at all, that would be like, oh, this is a big worry, a big concern. It's likely going to be a problem for him going forward for the rest of his career. But considering that he's fairly young in his MMA career, and he is doing it even if consistently, it's definitely something that he can work on. But then, yeah, also you mentioned the kind of like the spinning stuff and like the stuff that got him frequently taken down and in trouble in this fight. I think I saw someone comment or say something that made me quite laugh, which was like that Sandhagen walks a tightrope between being Max Holloway and between being Yair Rodriguez. And I think that's quite an apt comparison.
That is a very good way to put it.
When he's going forward, when he's building combinations off his jab and working the body and doing all that, he's fantastic. That's the Max Holloway in him. But then these days, I think it's probably due to the nature of his last two knockouts. I think he's kind of looking for these big moments now, and he almost like he's trying to force them, which is why you saw him frequently spin, which Dillashaw was able to really take advantage of and took him down a couple of times off of that, or get his back and then push him to the fence and control him there. So I think that kind of decision making kind of like is a thing that I think hopefully will come like with more maturity. So I think that this is like a loss that should teach him that realistically, because that got taken advantage of quite a number of times. So you'd think that he'd know that, his coaches should point that out. So I think this will be a good learning experience for him in that fight. And that he was and is good at like really attritional damage and building long combinations. And that's how he should be getting his finishes. But I think that he is now, because of like the spectacular last two knockouts, he is looking for those big moments a little too much.
Yeah, definitely.
Overall, I thought it was a really good performance from Sandhagen, and I mean from TJ as well, and I really enjoyed the fight. So it was really fun.
Yeah, I think we any not criticism, but any sort of thing we mentioned about Sandhagen has obviously got to be starred with the fact that we did think he won that fight. It's not like he did loads of stuff wrong. And I think we've seen with his improvements that he's made in his ground game following the Aljamain Sterling fight, that I think he's a quite intelligent and an intelligent fighter that is going to look at those sort of moments that perhaps lost him rounds and ultimately lost him the fight, and refine that, because he strikes me as that kind of guy. And by no means is he out of the title picture. He is still right up there in the thick of it. Be interesting to see what happens with TJ Dillashaw. I mean, I've no idea what's going on with Yan and Sterling. I don't know the timeline with Sterling and his neck, and who knows. But Dillashaw seemed to mention he wanted another fight before fighting for any sort of title. So I don't really know what else there is in terms of right up there at the top of the bantamweight division other than Sandhagen, but we'll see what awaits for him. But yeah, as you said, I'd echo what you say. A great fight, and regardless of whether Dillashaw is allegedly actually off any sort of illegal substances, it's still good to have him back amongst the bantamweights, which is still a cracking division.
Just like final thoughts, I suppose. Like you mentioned Aljamain Sterling there, and I think the things that kind of final comments would be that like things that got Sandhagen in trouble in the Sterling fight are still present, as like he does really try to. One of his main defenses for being taken down, like he very often gives his back. So that's still present. And although I may have thought that like Aljamain Sterling's like game plan in the first fight wouldn't be that replicable, I think now it probably might be. So still worries from that standpoint, I think. And then, going forward for like TJ, I think, for either of them, to be honest, I'm sure Rob Font would rather have the winner, but Rob Font fighting either of these two after this, I think is a good fight for all involved,
certainly.
Realistically. So I think that could be a fight to make. Probably you're going to do Rob Font and Dillashaw, and then Sandhagen will get, I don't know, someone lower ranked, take a bit of a step back and like kind of implement some changes and then make his next title run.
That's it's certainly exciting times for both of them, and those are.
It's the kind of fight where like, because of the kind of controversial nature of the decision, like both of their stock rose, and they're both coming out of this looking pretty good.
Certainly. Elsewhere on the card, what stood out for you? Anything that you particularly wanted to mention?
Well, Piver Phillips got the fight of the night, and it was a very fun one. Although, again, very bad judging. I'll never know how that first round wasn't given a 10-8 for Kyler Phillips, because Piver was basically knocked out and was woken up with ground and pound. So not a great decision. That should have been a draw. But still a fun fight nevertheless. Some good, in the first round especially, some nice intercepting elbows from Kyler Phillips that are always good fun. I love some elbows, so that was good. And then Adrian Yanez, Randy Costa, that was a good fun fight as well. Yanez seemed to like not be able to not be hit with the jab in the first round, and was just a target for it, was there. But then started to kind of push forward, break Costa down, and the finish was like a really nice combination for the finish, like really ripped his body well, landed an uppercut and just kind of folded Costa. So no, nice finish on that. But other than that, I don't know, not too much, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think those were certainly the two I was going to pick out. Yeah, that co-main event, Shane Phillips, I think, the 28-28 was quite clearly the right the correct scorecard to go for. But yeah, a really fun fight, and a good win for Piver, who I think was coming up from flyweight on late notice. I think it's supposed to be Rafael Assunção fighting Kyler Phillips. So yeah, good win for him, and I don't think Kyler Phillips' stock has particularly diminished too much. He's still a guy that is sort of interesting on those sort of fringes of the bantamweight rankings. Adrian Yanez, that was a weird one really in that first round. I mean, Randy Costa literally could not miss with that jab, and it's sort of like a sort of Wii boxing, which is spamming the jab button, and Yanez was just like decided just to not move his head for the first round. But poor from Costa really. I think in that second round, backing yourself, well, not backing yourself up, but allowing yourself to get backed up to the cage and then sort of shelling up against the cage is perhaps one of the least advisable tactics against Yanez, who we've seen as someone who, when he gets you there, he can pick a shot well and can finish, and that's exactly what he did. So a good win for him, but also a good showing for Randy Costa. Macy Barber, Miranda Maverick, a sort of a classic women's flyweight split decision. Two young fighters, particularly young in their MMA sort of careers, and as is the breadth and depth of the women's flyweight division, were already being lined up as future opponents to Valentina Shevchenko by both of the commentators, which I found particularly funny, given that Macy Barber is like 0-1 in her. I think is this her first fight? She's like 1-2 in her last 3 fights. I'm not quite sure what they were going on about there, but good win for her, and she's still young, but not a sort of particularly eye-catching fight. Mickey Gall is apparently still in the UFC. Got to win it.
Yeah, it was a nice little sub, actually. I did quite enjoy kind of Mickey Gall's work on the ground here. I think he was like considerably better. There was a big like golfing skill, I think. But I actually did enjoy like the work on the ground that led to the submission. He like threatened with a guillotine and then used it to sweep into mount and then threatened an arm triangle, but then used that to take the back and then got the choke. It was like actually a nice little sequence. But yeah, I'm surprised he's still in the UFC a little bit as well, but not too mad about it given that.
Yeah, that was a nice finish. I mean, those are really all the key talking points. I mean, I'm sort of bemused as I remind myself that Darren Elkins was third last on a card in 2021, but that's a discussion for another day.
And I think it was a fairly typical Darren Elkins fight.
Sort of losing all the way until victory.
Yeah. I think that an interesting comment I saw as well was that Darren Elkins is the reverse Michael Johnson, in which Michael Johnson normally goes into a fight, looks fairly fantastic early on, and then implodes and gets finished. And Darren Elkins is the exact opposite. He'll go into a fight, get absolutely battered, and then get a finish. Which, funnily enough, when they fought, it went exactly how you'd expect. It followed that exact pattern. So yeah, just thought that was quite.
Yeah, those two need to sort of merge beings and become one sort of one fighter. Because I mean, that damage tattoo on his chest, I think is a bit confused. He's supposed to be sort of giving the damage rather than taking it. I think he's got himself a bit too confused. But yeah, I mean, a sort of serviceable card. I say more than serviceable. It was a good card.
It was pretty
and certainly topped off with a really fun, interesting main event. I'm not sure I could carry such enthusiasm over to this weekend. We often are particularly quick to pull not particularly quick. We have in our time known to pull this is the worst UFC card I've ever seen. I think Anthony Smith versus Devin Clark as a main event was one that sort of I have locked up here ready to go. This genuinely could pip it. It's just bad. And you're going to have these fights if you're running fights every single weekend, bar basically 3 or 4 weeks off, which there seems to do. You're going to have these weeks, but it just means there's not a lot for us to talk about. And to be honest, the only fight that deserves some discussion, and the sum is being the operative word there, is the main event. Uriah Hall versus Sean Strickland. Uriah Hall, who finds himself on a 4-fight win streak, which when you actually look at it in detail is not as impressive. A sort of come from behind KO win against Bevan Lewis, which was a fight he was losing up until that point. A split decision against Antonio Carlos Jr., a TKO against a sort of had to be retired far earlier Anderson Silva, and then a TKO via leg break against Chris
without
Weidman,
throwing a single strike.
So a sort of not so impressive 4-fight win streak. One of the sort of least impressive 4-fight win streaks I've seen. Sean Strickland is a guy who's absolutely ginormous, and I have no understanding of how this is only his 4th fight in the UFC as a middleweight. Came up to middleweight, battered Jack Marshman for 15 minutes, knocked out Brendan Allen, and then battered Krzysztof Jotko for 15 minutes, 2 unanimous decisions, 1 KO. And he finds himself 11th in the UFC middleweight rankings. Uriah Hall ranked number 8. I mean, Sean Strickland is a guy that I don't think offers anything really intriguing to me, either as a sort of character, a personality, or as a fighter. But he is someone who is just like, he's always there. He's plodding forward. You know what you're going to get from Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Uriah Hall seems to have been sort of around the UFC for so long, and I still don't really know what I'm going to get with him. So I don't really know what my sort of thoughts are. I can quite comfortably see a sort of Sean Strickland 25-minute unanimous decision. I can also see a sort of bizarre Uriah Hall KO, because that seems to be his sort of modus operandi. I mean, have you got any more sort of illuminating thoughts on this fight?
Sean Strickland, whatever you may think of him as a personality, or as a person, as the fighter, he's like, yeah, kind of. I get what you mean. Like he can be a little bit interesting. He's got some kind of like interesting, like lanky pressure fighter kind of tactics. So it's not like charging. It's not kind of like, it's more kind of methodical pressure. Which is like, it's nice to see sometimes, as opposed to like a lot of the pressure that you'll see in the UFC is often very rush forward kind of. But yeah, it's more interesting in that regard. So I think that's probably how this fight will work out, because generally Uriah Hall isn't the type of guy to enforce a kind of directionality or kind of like, or force the fight to take place necessarily in the space that he wants it to. So I think that with Strickland pressuring forward, he'll probably be able to do that. And it'll be interesting to see how Uriah Hall deals with that against Costa for the first round or so, before he started getting punched in the dick by Costa. He showed actually a really good jab off the back foot. So it'll be interesting in that regard. If he looks kind of as good as that and can land that with consistency, I think we could have a fairly decent fight on our hands. But it just depends kind of, how they match up. But there's not too much to say, just kind of, initial thoughts of how the kind of like directionality of the fight might play out. But other than that, nothing really to say.
Yeah, it's one that I think could be a fun fight, but it's not sort of leaping out of the page. And to be honest, none of the other fights here are particularly leaping out of the Wikipedia page. So might be one that we can offer some brief thoughts about next week before we turn our attention to UFC 265 at the weekend, which we were discussing before we recorded. Perhaps hasn't got that sort of crowning main event, but has got some pretty interesting fights on there. I mean, at least some fighters, Luque, Angela Hill, Vasayev, favourites of the pod there at least.
I've just noticed. Wait, stop. This is a great card, actually, the one coming up this weekend. We have a former UFC champion on the undercard. I've missed that. We have Nico Montano on the undercard. So actually, I've changed my mind. It's a fantastic card.
Oh, no. Oh, God. We do have UFC heritage there.
Yeah. But also, of this week's card, Hani Yaya Kyung Kyo Kang is a decent fight as well. But that is it. That's literally it.
Yeah, that Nico Montano record makes for interesting reading. 4-3, but also the inaugural women's flyweight champion. There's an interesting record. So we'll be back to offer some probably brief thoughts about that fight card next week, and also turn our attention towards UFC 265. So until then, stay safe, have a good weekend, everyone, and we'll see you then.
See ya.